Hi, everyone. We're going to give it a second while we let all of our attendees join, so just be patient for a moment. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Mackenzie Morin, and I am a 2006 graduate from the University of Dayton. Since I've graduated, I have lived in Florida, Colorado, Indiana, and I have called Ohio my home for the last 6.5 years. And the reason I moved to Ohio was to work in the Alumni Association. So came back to the area to work at UD. I'm really excited to moderate today's discussion with our 3 panelists. I want to let you know that we are taking questions throughout the session. So you'll see the Q&A feature is activated. Feel free to submit your questions at any time, and I'll work those into the program as we're talking. And we're also recording today. So if you want to rewatch it at a later date or share it with your roommates that weren't able to attend today, we'll have that available for you. If those of you that are senior, we want to let you know that we are very excited for you to join us in the Alumni Association. The Alumni Association has over 120,000 alums, and once you graduate, you're automatically in. The success of the Alumni Association is strongly based on the work that our volunteers do for us. And today, on today's call, we have 3 really phenomenal leadership volunteers that are joining us. And they have all made major moves across the country pre and post UD. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to introduce our panelists. And our first panelist is Sarah Hemler. She is a 2013 grad. She is an account manager at Advanced Sterilization Products. While she was at UD, she majored in leadership and marketing with a sales focus. And she is on the board of the Alumni Association and is our current Day 10 chair. So Sarah, why don't you share with us a couple of your big moves?
Sure. Thanks, Mackenzie. So my name is Sarah Hemler. I'm excited to be here today and share some of the experiences I've had. So I've moved 6 times over the last 7 years since leaving UD. So my friends like to joke that they don't know where I live. Thank goodness for social media that I can keep up with people. And I've actually had a chance to see a lot of my friends from UD as I've moved all these different places. So at a high level, after UD, I moved to California. After that, I moved to New Jersey, to Florida, to Sarasota on the Gulf Coast. And I actually lived in a hotel for 7 months. So I can speak a little bit about that later for work purposes, and then moved to Orlando, Florida, and then stayed there for the longest amount of time so far. Came up to Atlanta, moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and then just moved back to Atlanta in January. So I've been kind of here, there, and everywhere, a couple different time zones and experiences. So excited to share more as we get into the conversation today.
Thanks, Sarah. I actually lived in Sarasota as well. Great city. So
nice beaches, yeah.
Yeah. Since Sarah is our current Day 10 chair, it's a nice lead into our next panelist. Khristian Santiago is a 2016 grad, and he is our former Day 10 chair. While at UD, he majored in business operations and supply management, and he currently is the global business strategy associate with Google. So welcome, Khristian. Tell us about your moves.
Thanks. And as Sarah mentioned, she was in Day 10 and we were on it together. So it was always hard to keep track of her and like what did we need to shift time zones or what was going on. But for me, after UD, I moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, which sounds like a very odd move, but I can dig into that a little bit later. And I'm currently based in San Francisco. So time zones are a real thing, but I'm happy where I am today.
And Khristian, you had a pretty big move pre-UD as well, right?
Yeah, so I'm from Puerto Rico, born and raised. So made the move from hot, warm weather all year round to whatever Ohio weather is considered. I remember the first time it got down to 60, I took out my winter coat, and my friends on Founders 2 South were laughing at me. It's like, you think this is cold? You're in for a surprise.
Yeah. Yes, and so our final panelist is Dan Wolfe. He is a 16 grad as well. He is a procurement agent with Boeing. He majored in business operations and supply management. And Dan is our Seattle community leader. Dan, welcome and share some of your moves with us.
Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I do not have as many moves as Khristian and Sarah, but I am originally from the Chicago area and went to UD, and then after UD, I ended up moving to Seattle full-time for a job. During college, though, I did live in Seattle for a summer, as well as St. Louis for a summer for internships, too, so I do have a few moves during college as well, too. So thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you. So we're going to dive into our questions. Like I said, you can submit questions at any time and we'll work those in. So I'm going to start with Sarah. Sarah, can you tell us about your first post-graduation move? Why did you choose the city you moved to? Was it for work, grad school, for family?
Yeah, so my first move was my biggest move, I would say, cross coast over to California. And I lived in San Jose, so just south of San Francisco, and it was for work. So I was fortunate to, right out of school, get an opportunity to work for Johnson & Johnson in a sales and leadership development program. Part of that program was the expectation that you would move quite a few times to get experience in home office, as well as rotate to get sales experience in the field. So I knew going in that there'd be some movement, but truthfully, there was supposed to be 1 whole year in California before moving, and it turned out to only be about 4.5, 5 months. And then due to changes in the business, we unexpectedly were asked to relocate to New Jersey in the winter. So little bit of disappointment, feeling like a cool Ohio college grad moving to California, and then, you know, rug pulled out from under us. But yeah, so really purely for work purposes did I choose where to go. And it was a big move, probably the one I was a little most nervous about, you know, my first time trying to find an apartment and living on my own and figuring everything out. And I couldn't have been further from my family, which are actually all in Ohio. So that was my first move. It was the biggest and turned out to be kind of short-lived, but the rest of the journey unfolded from there.
Thank you. Chris, what about you? Was your first move for work, grad school, family?
Yeah, my first move was for work as well. So I was based in Ann Arbor with Google. And what's funny looking back at it is my first experience with Google was through an internship. And when they offered me the internship, they said, oh, we'll be based in Ann Arbor. If you get an offer full time, it would also be based in Ann Arbor. My first reaction was, how can I move to the Bay Area instead of Ann Arbor? And I remember it was very tactical reason. They said they couldn't change my internship because the dates would overlap with the start of school back on campus if I were to do Mountain View. So in a sense, like Google ended up picking for me where I would start my career. And I can dive a little bit more into that, but yeah, I didn't really know that tech had a presence like that in Ann Arbor, but definitely don't regret it.
Dan, how about for you?
Yeah, mine was work as well, actually. So during college, I had interned for Boeing, actually out here in Seattle for a summer after my sophomore year. Fell in love with the area, but was pretty far from home, being from Chicago. So decided to work for Boeing in St. Louis the following summer as an intern, and just didn't think it was necessarily the best fit for me in that role. So stayed in contact with some folks from my internship in Seattle and was able to get a full-time position back in Seattle after graduation. So kind of was back and forth, but really it's just for the job ultimately.
Great. So Khristian, you kind of set us up for this next question. I'm gonna ask if you were willing to move to any city for the job. Because I mean, if you look, you went from warm to cool to cold. So were you willing to move anywhere for Google?
Yes. And I think the big reason why, and I think it's a little bit between the three of us, is that big company brand early in your career can definitely pay dividends later on, right? Like no one can take away from Sarah, she worked at Johnson & Johnson. No one can take away from Dan that he worked at Boeing. And for me, no one can take from me that I worked at Google. So it was a calculated move in terms of starting in Ann Arbor. The other big piece, and this has to do a lot with company culture, is trying to understand why that office is there. For example, for Danny, Seattle is HQ for Boeing, so it makes a lot of sense. For Ann Arbor, it was a very young office in terms of a lot of people straight out of college were starting there. So the advantage to that was that a lot of people were focused on developing and getting adjusting to the workforce and what does it actually look like to work 80 hours a week. That's why I don't regret my move, because it was a really good training ground. But at the end of the day, yes, if Google had told me you're going to Montana, that would have been like, cool, let me buy some boots, like a cowboy hat, and make whatever happen to join the company.
Sarah, you had touched on with your role in Johnson & Johnson that you were going to be expected to move. Did you get any say in where you started or what that move pattern would look like, or was it just kind of like, we'll tell you?
Yeah, more we'll tell you. The first spot, so there were 5 of us that went into this program, and actually 2 of us from UD. So I did kind of have a UD companion going out there with me, and she's originally from the Chicago area, and we're still good friends. But we all went to California because of a headquarters office there, to Chris's point. And then we moved to New Jersey to go to another J&J headquarters office. And then from there, we all actually got split up. So I worked in New Jersey for about 7 months in a home office role. Some of my counterparts got sent to other places. One of them was covering a territory in the Bronx in the middle of New York City, thrown into there. Someone else was sent to Baltimore. And then when it came time for my field rotation, that's when I was sent to Sarasota. And it was basically my manager coming up to me one day saying, hey, guess what? We got your placement. Where are you going? And I said, I don't know, where am I going? And she said, Sarasota, Florida. And I said, I'll do it. I'm not complaining. So Abby, who also was from UD, got sent to Los Angeles. So she's got sent right back to the West Coast. So really, we just went wherever they said that we would have the opportunity. But it was an amazing opportunity to be in that role at that age and point in my life, to be having that kind of responsibility, managing a territory and having a job that has, great earning potential and a great upward trajectory. So there may have been the ability to seek some preference or put something in there, but I told them very upfront from the beginning that I will go wherever the job needs me to go. And I think my perspective is maybe a little different because I moved a lot growing up. I went to 6 schools by the time I graduated high school. So to me, you can be happy anywhere and you can learn things and get yourself acclimated. And if you don't like it, you can move again. So I never really thought of any of these moves as permanent or this is the end of the road for me.
Yeah, I think that's a great mindset to have. And it really can help with your career path if you're willing to move like that. Dan, now you have a unique background in the fact that you got to intern in Seattle before you moved there. So I guess whether it was from your internship or from when you first moved there, were there things after your internship and then you decided you were going to move there, like that you really took into consideration about, like, how did you find housing? Did you find a roommate or do you live alone? Did you ever think about like the convenience of, okay, I'm in Seattle, how am I going to be able to visit Chicago?
Yeah, those were all things that kind of factored into my decision or kind of were on the checklist as I was thinking about this move. So when I interned out here, I actually lived closer to where my office was, which is about 45 minutes north of actually Seattle. So more suburban neighborhood, and you were in this intern housing setup. So it was very easy. But I knew moving out here full time, I wanted to be actually in Seattle. I didn't necessarily know a lot of people moving out here, or really anyone before I moved out here. So I wanted to be in a place where it'd be easier to meet people around my age, a little bit more lively and action going on. And so I really didn't spend much time in the city when I was interning out here. I was 19 with all these interns out in the suburbs. So I really didn't know Seattle that well before I moved out here. Fortunately, though, a lot of companies will actually pair you up with, they kind of outsource their housing or outsource their relocation. So I was fortunate that Boeing offers a relocation package for you. And with that came this housing specialist. So they really act as kind of like a leasing agent or a realtor for you and tell you like where to live, maybe where not to live, kind of a good buildings or whatnot, and really give you a lot of guidance in that. So that was really helpful. I was also fortunate too, because before I had accepted my offer with Boeing, I was actually out here interviewing for another company in Seattle. And part of that interview was they gave you a day to explore the city and look at housing too. So that's, I know a lot of companies are doing that as well. So I was able to kind of do my research from my dorm room at Dayton, or my house at Dayton, and then find some apartments that really seemed of interest or thought maybe it'd be a good fit. And then once I got here, actually able to look at those a little bit more in depth and really get an understanding of where I wanted to live. As far as who I lived with or living with roommates, I personally chose to live alone. That was just something, I'd come out of living with 9 guys my senior year of college. So I just wanted a little bit more personal space. I knew I'd be waking up at like 5 in the morning for work, and just really wanted to get adjusted to professional life and not have to worry about the extra factor. That said, most of my friends that I've met here who have also moved to Seattle from other locations found roommates via a Facebook page or Craigslist or whatever it is. And I would say 90% of them have had a positive experience with it. Again, it's not permanent. You know, you can make it through a year if it's it's not an ideal situation. But I do know a lot of people who did that and have loved it. And then, yeah, Seattle is pretty far from Chicago. It's about a 4-hour flight, which was something that made my decision hard to do. Unlike Chris and Sarah, I was not as willing to move anywhere necessarily for the job. If it wasn't Seattle, I don't know if I would be at Boeing. I think I might have looked somewhere else in Chicago. But I did, and really liked Seattle. I liked Boeing ultimately. And I'm really close to my family. So I ultimately weighed the pros and cons of it and figured, as kind of Sarah and Chris mentioned, it's not permanent. And that was also something that I realized too, is that was the first time in your life where there's not a set in stone time period that you have to be doing something, right? You go to high school for 4 years, you go to college for 4 years, and then you graduate and get your full-time position, and really have that freedom to, if it doesn't work out, you can move anytime, you know, you really have that freedom to do so. So it didn't seem as permanent and as daunting of a move when I framed it in that mindset.
Wait, Danny, where'd you live senior year?
I lived on Trinity, next to the Wedge, 1912 Trinity. Lived in the basement.
There we go.
Khristian, I'm going to take this to you. With your move to Ann Arbor, had you ever been there before? And what did you do to prepare for that move? Like, was there a housing situation where Google helped you with that? And then talking about like your family being in Puerto Rico, like, did you think about the convenience of visiting family?
Yeah, definitely. Had I lived in Ann Arbor before? Yes. So I interned there my junior to senior year. So I got a good sense of what the city would be like. It's just the University of Michigan and a couple of restaurants in a way. No offense if anyone's from Ann Arbor here. But I think to that piece, I also knew it was close to Detroit. For one side, it's like a city I could go if I wanted to do something more city-like, but two, it means that I had a major airport too. So to your question around concerns being away from Puerto Rico, that curbed it a bit. There were no direct flights up through when I moved out of Ann Arbor, which was annoying. But before that, and with a good layover, it would take me about 6.5 hours to get from Michigan to Puerto Rico. So that was definitely doable. I think in order to prepare for the move to Ann Arbor, it's a couple factors, and this kind of gets into later topics, but my best friend got into Michigan School of Medicine. So as soon as he told me that, which I remember we were on the porch of 403 Stone Mill, and he looked me in the eyes like, I just submitted my acceptance to Michigan. I'm like, amazing. We knew that we were going to look for housing together. And yes, he started a little bit earlier than I did, so it took a little bit of time for us to actually figure it out. And then I actually also went with him for his interview, so I could do a little bit of housing research. I think to Dan's point, I found my first apartment via Craigslist. it is a little bit sketchy. So if you ever do anything like that, just like double check everything. Unfortunately, there's some bad actors out there. And the last piece I want to mention about the relocation is like negotiations. Be strategic what you can. So when Google gave me the relocation offer, Google, when you start with them, usually give you a cash option instead of the moving services. But they said, oh, we're going to give you this amount because you're moving from Ohio to Michigan. I played not dumb, but I asked, hey, I'm actually moving from Puerto Rico. I don't have anything in Dayton. I mean, I left like a couple boxes there. So I'm going to need to buy everything from you. So they said, okay, fair. They revisited and I ended up getting 3 times the relocation cash bonus that I was getting prior to. Obviously, I did not need all of it, so I could save some good cash for myself. But if you can, and depending on the company, the dynamics, don't be afraid to negotiate any part, really, salary, bonus, compensation, all of that. But fortunately, being there the summer prior did make the move a bit more comfortable than just moving to Ann Arbor without ever living there.
Thanks. Yeah, you bring up a good point in that if you are going to move, like if it's not just a quick 4-hour drive, but rather across country, sometimes it is better to push for hey, I'm going to buy new items out there, so it'll be cheaper to move, but can we help with the payment of these other items? So that's going to move us into more of this like bills section. Like, okay, I've graduated, now I've got these bills coming to me. So Sarah, I'm going to start with you. How did you figure out, because you have lived in so many different cities and like Midwest versus coast and South, how did you figure out cost of living and then establish a budget?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, the internet is great and you can do a lot of research in terms of looking even just on apartments.com and looking at, to Danny's point, if you want to live closer to the city, it's typically more expensive. The further out you get, there's other options. So I typically do a lot of research online, narrowing down the features or benefits that I want in my apartment, what's the amount of money I'm willing to spend, and then, make the short list of where you're going to visit. And once you start looking at apartments, there's the Craigslist route, like Chris mentioned, probably an independent landlord versus I lived in a lot of large apartment complexes where you really can't negotiate rent. It is what it is. And you want to make sure you ask about any extra fees. I've lived places where there's a valet trash fee, non-negotiable. Your trash goes outside your door, they're picking it up, they're charging you $30 a month for it. That's it. Too bad if you want to live here. So there's lots of things like that to just ask questions as you're looking at where to live, and make sure you don't just look at the rent, but you look at what are the additional fees on top of that, especially to think about internet, which you're going to have to pay for to get that hooked up. You can ask what's the average cost of utility bills here if you're paying utilities on top of your rent. And for me, being in a sales career, I don't know if anyone is, going that path, but our payment plan is usually different, right? I have a salary and then I have a commission or bonus portion of my earnings. So for me, I've always created my budget off of just my salary, which allows me some flexibility with that extra part of my income to put towards savings or towards, a fun vacation or whatever I want to do with that. But to always make sure you're living within the means of what you're making. So for some people, that may mean, you do need a roommate, because cutting rent in half definitely lowers, the financial burden. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it, but I think just being smart, rent will be the biggest chunk of where your money goes. It still is for me today. I rent a townhouse in Atlanta right now, and I don't even want to tell you how much it is. So, and I'm sure Chris's place is expensive in San Francisco and in Seattle. We're all in, bigger cities right now, so it is more expensive, but the location really is key. I think sometimes you get what you pay for in that regard. I can appreciate what Dan said about, being in kind of the intern suburb bubble and then wanting to live where you can meet people. I've chosen a lot of the places I've lived based on when you go and tour, like take a look around, who's there. Are there young people hanging out at the pool? Or do they have a gym? Are there people working out? Are there people doing the types of things that you like to do? Are there people sitting on their porches, having a drink? Things like that are good signs that you're going to move into your new community and actually be able to make friends, right where you live, which is great. So it may be a trade-off in terms of, how much you're willing to spend versus what you're getting for that money, if that makes sense. So I think it's definitely a case-by-case basis, based on what expenses you have, but you need to be very mindful and list all those things out, from your car to your gas to your internet bills and groceries, and it just keeps coming, and figure out what does that look like for you and what's realistic for your first apartment. And you can always move on and move up after that lease term.
Yeah, can I jump in, Mackenzie?
Yes, please.
I agree with everything Sarah said. I think the way that I've thought about it is really treating it as an income statement, right? Like, I am a business and I like to invest in myself. So a couple of things is, obviously, one, just listing out like all your income, and then two, every week or like every 2 weeks, I actually like categorize all my expenses. And what I've taken away from it's more of just awareness. Like, here's where my money's going. It's not necessarily a bad, like, it's not a bad thing. Like, COVID has been hard, and I treated myself to a couple video games last month. So that made like my shopping expenses go a little bit up. But I know that that's where it was going. And I think to that sense, I want to make sure that there's something at the end of the month that I can just put towards my savings, because that's how you start building good amount of wealth over time. And then you can get into investing and all these other things that we won't cover today. But I think the piece around just really like writing down every single expense is probably going to be the thing that empowers you most to just take control over what the day-to-day looks like. I think the other thing to start looking into, and now that we're in COVID, is what expenses can be reimbursed by especially if you work with a big corporation. So for example, Google covers my internet expenses. And I'm going to assume that a lot of companies are going to trend towards that because of the increase in remote work that's going on. So really do check all the benefits that your company offers. I'm trying to think of other ones that I get for free. At Google, you get therapy for free, 25 sessions a year. So that doesn't have to hit like my insurance or anything like that. They allow me to expense some work from home stuff because of COVID, but I think it's really important to know like what your income is, categorize the expenses, and look what you can have, like your if you go for a big company, what you can have them pay for.
Khristian, can I ask, did they tell you that, or have you had to ask? Like, and how did you have that conversation?
Yeah, good question. I did have to ask. What happened there was just like, it took me about 9 months to realize that they would cover my internet bill when I started at Google. You'll probably have like a buddy or someone who like helps you on board to the company. It's okay to ask all these things. It's more just because of the awareness than anything. I don't think it's like a bad brand perception of like, oh, you're asking for the company to pay you something. Yeah, they should. Most of these companies make a good amount of money. $75 a month towards my internet's not going to hurt anyone. So yes, you need to ask to make sure you get an understanding of all the benefits that your company covers.
Thank you. I do want to remind everyone, don't forget, you can submit questions and we'll get those in the program. But I'm going to keep going, and I want to ask about the apartment piece or the renting piece. Have any of you, and actually I'm going to ask this one to Danny, have you worked with a month-to-month lease versus a yearly lease, and have you seen a benefit to one over the other?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So when I first moved out here, I signed a 1-year lease. I didn't really think of doing anything shorter or longer. That was just kind of the standard that I was seeing in most buildings. So I went with the 1-year lease. From there, I moved out and moved in with 2 other roommates, and we rented a townhome from a landlord. So it was the guy who owned the house. So that again was a 1-year lease. And then from there, I moved into another apartment out on my own and started with the 1-year lease. Again, it was with the guy who owned the condo that I rent from him. Started with the 1-year lease and then moved to month lease. He offered it and there was no premium charge. A lot of times you'll see an extra fee for a shorter lease or a longer, or for a month-to-month lease. So generally the cheaper option is to go like 12 to 18 months. You'll see usually a discount on rent with that. Unlike Sarah, I've always, or for the most part, I've worked directly with the owner of the property. I haven't gone through larger buildings or, property management companies. So I think you might get a little bit more flexibility in those negotiations and those options. So this past year, when my month-to-month lease came up, I actually went for a full year of month-to-month, and decided that I like the place. I've been here for 2 years. I'll sign for another year, and I was able to do that and also negotiate down my rent while doing that as well too. I think part of it happened with COVID. He didn't really want to go through the hassle of renting out a place or dealing with all that. So I kind of use that to my advantage. But yeah, usually I've gone year to year, and I think that's probably, you'll get the most bang for your buck, and you'll likely see a premium. But sometimes it is nice if you're not sure and you are moving to a new city, and maybe you are choosing to move in alone, but you want that option of, meeting friends or having a roommate once you get a little more comfortable with the city. I think maybe doing like a 6-month lease isn't necessarily a bad option, and it's usually like $50 more a month or so. So it's not significant, but it is something to consider.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question, and I don't know if it actually applies to any of you, but I've had to deal with this one. So have any of you worked with a company for your moving expenses? Khristian, I know you talked about Google a little bit, but how did you have that conversation, and so the question is, does it hurt to ask? Will it be held against you to ask for moving expenses?
No, especially if it's a major relocation. Think about it as like more than one state away. I would assume it's more standard nowadays to ask, but it could also, now I'm saying this out loud, become the norm with COVID that these conversations are going to look different. But if they're asking you, the business requires you to live in a different state, or I would say at least a 3-hour drive away, it does not hurt to ask. Because worst case, they say no. And best case, they say, here's a couple $1,000 for you to take care of that.
And I would add
go ahead, Danny.
So I was going to say, I would add to that, at a lot of larger companies, the people that you're negotiating your salary and your moving expenses or anything like any of your benefits with generally isn't the manager that you're working for or the team. It was very segregated. And so you have your HR, or they outsource it, and then you have your actual team that you're going to. And the manager's usually not involved in those initial conversations. So I wouldn't say it would hurt to ask, because they probably don't even know that conversation is being had in most cases.
Great point.
Yeah, real quickly, because I know we probably want to talk about a couple other things, but I've had it a couple different ways. I've had full relocation 2 or 3 times where movers have come, they pack everything up, they put it in the truck, they paid to ship my car, they paid for my hotel in between. I mean, like full Queen of England treatment. It was great. I've had it other ways too, where I've just gotten a cash lump sum. Here, you do what you want with it. In that case, yeah, you pack yourself and you drive the U-Haul so you can pocket the money, in my opinion. So that's what I would do. But, they may offer the option, like Chris kind of brought up, where you could ask, hey, instead of the full relocation package, can I have the cash amount? One thing to make sure is to read any language around it. I've gotten money before where, hey, if you leave before 1 year, you're going to owe us this money back. If you leave before 2 years, you're going to owe us half this money back. So you just want to be cognizant of what those terms are and make sure you're comfortable with it, and make sure that, it's something that if you did need to leave for some reason, you were able to pay that back and hold up your end of the obligation. But I think there's other ways to ask for it too. If they say, we don't do relocation, you could ask, can I have a sign-on bonus, and throw a figure out that you would be comfortable with, $5,000 or whatever it might be. So there are other ways to phrase it if they say they don't do relocation, to try to get yourself a little cash to get started. Because the other thing about apartments is typically there's a deposit, some kind of admin fee, first month's rent, maybe last month's rent. So you're gonna need some cash to get started, and they know that. And I think if they're hiring someone right out of school, they probably expect you to ask.
Yeah, and a little detail to add to everything Sarah just mentioned. If you get anytime you get any cash from a company, it's taxed. And I know it's like an obvious thing, but you really learn it once you see like what your net pay is, and then what your pay after taxes are. At least I've cried out once or twice at the difference, but I think like a detail to remember.
No, Khristian, I think that was a huge shock to everyone on their, like, it said the salary is this, but why am I getting this much? So that's a really good point to pay attention to.
Especially too, when you're looking for like rent and you think you have this, you can do this monthly rent because you just break your salary divided by 12 months. don't do that. Factor in tax, factor in what I did. Like if you have a 401k option, you're going to want to put a percentage into that right away. I have
Insurance.
go to insurance, to savings right off the bat. So factor those things in first before you make your rental and like living expense budget, because it is a pretty significant amount of money, unfortunately.
Yeah. Hashtag adulting. We got a really great question, and I'm going to break it down a little bit because I think it's really worth doing this. So the question is about, we have a student who she's asking about, how did you get out there to meet new peers in a new area? But answer this question pre-COVID. So you've moved to your city. How did you meet people in a new city? So Sarah, let's start with you.
Sure. I think there's a lot of different ways you can do this. And I think a lot of it depends on your personality and what you're comfortable with. But a couple things that I would do and that I have done that have been successful. One is share on your social media, whatever platforms you use. Back in the day, for me, 7 years ago, it was Facebook, but I don't have that anymore. I'm cool, I have Instagram. But I shared on Facebook, hey, I'm moving to Sarasota, Florida. Really excited, but I don't know anyone there. And someone I know from UD reached out to me. Her name is Annie, and she said, hey, Sarah, I'm from Sarasota. I have a friend from high school named Kelsey, and you two would totally hit it off. So Annie was kind enough to reach out and respond and introduce me to Kelsey. Kelsey and I are now, the best of friends 6 years later. So don't be afraid to put it out there. I'm moving to a new city. Does anyone know anyone? And kind of meet your friends of your friends. If someone's your really good friend, you're probably going to like their friends, from high school or other ways that they know them. That's one recommendation I have. Another one is to look for fun things to do. For example, in Florida, I got really involved with a kickball league, and it's just young professionals playing kickball. This is very common, like all over the country, and it's just a social thing, lots of young professionals. And that is a great way to meet people, and you can sign up not knowing anyone, or if you know one person, get them to sign up with you, and you can meet some more people that way. Another great way, of course, is to do something with your UD alumni community. You know that they're going to be friendly because they're UD people. If you're intimidated to attend something, and Danny's probably the best person to speak about this, but there's certain events that are well attended and like very welcoming, anything that's a game watch or Christmas off campus, people love that because it just brings everyone back to UD. And always feel free to reach out to anyone through LinkedIn or Flyer Connection who you see is a UD alumni that lives there, because I've never been turned down by UD alumni to, meet up or tag along with me somewhere. So I think those are a couple ideas that I would suggest. If you do have coworkers or colleagues and they invite you to happy hour or to do something like that, the best tip I have is just to say yes. Or if you meet a new friend and they invite you to go do something, try to say yes, even if you're nervous or you're not sure it's going to be fun or you don't know what to wear. It doesn't matter. Go, you won't regret it. You'll probably meet, more people, and that's really how you start to build your network and get involved in the community, is by putting yourself out there in whichever way you're comfortable doing.
Yeah. So Danny, you moved from one of our largest alumni communities to one of our smaller ones. How have you taken advantage of what the Alumni Association has to offer in a new city?
Yeah, so and I moved out here not knowing a single person. So it was very much like you got to do anything you can to, make connections, kind of as Sarah said, and just always say yes and do whatever you can to put yourself out there. And so I used the Dayton connection here. It's a pretty small group, and it was and kind of still is a smaller group in Seattle, but it's definitely has people engaged. So the first event I went to was Christmas off campus, and met some people who were living in the Seattle area. And this was just a few months after I had moved there. So that was my first event that I went to, and got involved. And, I've been seeing those people periodically throughout my time here. It's been 4 years now. And we're not always, hang out all the time, but, just having that connection and knowing that there are other people in the city is really important. It makes it feel a little bit more at home as well, too, just building those roots. But Sarah kind of alluded to it, is my connection went from when I was talking to my friends at Dayton of like their high school friends, or their coworkers or whoever it is. That's how I've made most of my friends here, is friends of friends that kind of snowballed into this larger group, but it really stemmed from my connections at UD. So that's been really helpful. And also, Sarah mentioned like intramurals is really big, the kickball league. So I'm like probably the least athletic person you'll ever meet. So I was pretty intimidated to go to an intramural sport with people who I had no idea who they were. But it's a great way. We have kickball out here, and it's a really fun way. They're usually on work nights too, so it kind of helps like break up the week a little bit and give you some activity. And then you go like a happy hour after or something too, just to kind of get to know people a little bit more. So just saying yes. And I think anyone who's moving to a new city generally is a little bit more outgoing and, ready to take on that big leap. So just staying true to that and being open to really any activity or people and, putting yourself out there is really key.
So this is going to be our last question, and I think it's pretty relevant right now. And Khristian, I'm going to start with you. Any advice for someone who is making a major move now to a new city during COVID? Any advice for how they can meet people?
Yeah, it's a great question. And my sister didn't graduate from UD, unfortunately, but she just moved to a new city. I think what I've seen from her is really the points that have been brought up by Dan and by Sarah, like try friends of friends and all that good stuff. I think it's okay to acknowledge that it's going to be hard. That's like the real talk in times of COVID. Like it'll take you a little bit, and it'll feel uncomfortable, and you'll probably have to join some awkward Zoom calls and Zoom happy hours. But I think another important piece is also just to leverage like your network at work, right? There's probably some level of employee resource group or affinity groups that happen there. You can get a start there to meet a couple of folks. But I think it's so like my big thing during COVID, it's like okay to acknowledge that things aren't going well right now in the world. But so just use that as an anchor if it takes a little bit of time or if you feel like it's getting difficult to meet new people. But yeah, then outside of that, obviously being very safe and knowing what you're doing when you're going out there, going to some types of socially distant events, things in the park. It's a little bit different of social gatherings that we're used to, but always being smart and safe.
Yeah, I think you hit on it with the social distancing. If you're not in a big city, there are a lot of events outside that you can still do, going hiking and things like that. Danny or Sarah, any input you'd like to give on that one? Sarah?
I'm with Chris. Yeah, I'm with Chris. I think it's okay to acknowledge it's going to be a little bit harder, but I think just getting creative and finding ways to make those connections and doing maybe the simple things, like, if you just sit in your apartment and don't do anything, it's probably going to be hard to meet people, but tapping into those virtual events or just doing, going outside and going for a walk. And if you see someone on their porch, or on their balcony in your new apartment building, wave and say hi and say, hey, I just moved to the area. Like, what's your favorite restaurant? Where's the best place to get tacos? Like make some conversation and start practicing, building rapport with strangers who may or may not become your friends, but the more you do it and, just be friendly, the more you'll make connections and, slowly start to build up your circles. The other thing, like Danny said, is just to be open-minded. I've made a lot of friends in different cities I've lived in that maybe are quite a bit older than me, or maybe they're quite younger than me and they do a profession that's completely different than me, or their background's completely different than mine, but that's okay. And I think that's how you get involved in the community and in the city and learn more things that you can do. So, just because someone doesn't look like, they're probably not like a new grad, right out of school, I'm probably not going to say hi. You should do it, because they probably want to be your friends. They'll probably sit outside and, have a drink with you and catch up. And everybody's lonely right now in COVID time and craving human interaction. So I would just take advantage of that. But like Chris said, just be smart and do what you're comfortable with, and take into consideration, the market and area that you're in and what's happening with current events and COVID and whatnot.
So before I wrap up, Danny, I do want to give any last minute, anything you want to share before I wrap us up?
No, I think they've kind of wrapped it up pretty well. I know it is kind of a challenging time. It may really seem daunting right now to move to a new city, but I think Chris was kind of mentioning too, it's important to know that like, no matter where you are, if you're moving to a new city or you're moving back to your hometown, we're all going through something similar together, and our social lives aren't as active or as lively as they once were, and that's okay to acknowledge. And give it time in a new city. It took me like a long time, almost over a year, to really feel comfortable in Seattle and really feel at home. And I remember that first year kind of feeling like, did I make that right decision? This is taking longer. Don't have this large group of friends that I once had at Dayton. And that's okay too. It's a different phase of your life. And I think just acknowledging that and accepting that and going into it knowing that probably will be the case is really important. And just, being open, being willing to try new things and put yourself out there is just going to get you really far.
Yes. Chris, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think just to everything Dan just said, I think the other reality is that it could happen every time you move. Because when Dan said like the first year was rough, I remember I moved to San Francisco 2 years after being in Ann Arbor, and I would agree that my first year here was rough. For a lot of reasons, but I think it's again similar to like setting expectations and knowing that the anchor is that it will take a while to move that transition. At least for me personally, my girlfriend then moved to the city, and that obviously makes life 10 times easier. But I think don't, and Sarah can probably talk to this way more than I can. But just know that it's going to, like, every time it's going to be a little bit of work that you need to put in to make sure that you're comfortable into a new space that you're moving at. And I think in terms of parting words, which I assume was what you were going to get to, Mackenzie, if you want to make a big move in terms of location, I would do it earlier in your career than later. You can always find your way back home, but I think it's a little bit harder to find your way away. Plus, I think there's just like life growth and things that happen when you are forced a little bit more into these situations. So if you get an opportunity that's a little bit far from home, that's going to feel a little bit weird and uncomfortable. That probably means it's a good sign that you'll be able to learn something from it. It may be a good thing, it may be not a good thing that you learn, but I think it's important and easier as well to do it early in your career than later when marriage, kids, family, other life dependencies come into play.
Yes. Sarah, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say final thoughts are, similar to what Chris said, but just stay positive and, focus on the good and the exciting things that are happening in your life, your new job, pour your energy into that. And another good idea, if you move somewhere and you don't know someone, is invite one of your college roommates or best friends to come visit you. And while they're with you, go explore the city, and go out and try to, tag team and talk to people and meet people. So there's always ways to do it that you're going to feel comfortable, and you just got to push yourself and keep going. But it does get better, and every move is going to have its hiccups. I can say that for sure, and nothing's always perfect everywhere, but it's really exciting to live new places. I've blindly moved most of the places I've moved. They said, will you move here? And I said, okay, I've been in the Atlanta airport once. Sure, I'll move there. So it works out, is what I would say. And if it doesn't, you can make a change. So I would say just don't hesitate to reach out to people for help. That's, a big piece. You don't have to do it alone, even if you've moved alone. And I know Chris and Dan and myself would be more than happy if you guys have specific questions or things like that. You can find us on Flyer Connection and LinkedIn and things like that. So always happy to help and get you guys acclimated into the Alumni Association any way that we can.
Yes, thank you. So thank you to our panelists for their amazing insight on their moves post-UD life. It's been a great conversation and very insightful. And something that I want, I hope our students recognize is we always talk about our Flyer community on campus, but it doesn't end when you graduate. It's actually much larger when you graduate. So if you make these moves and you don't know anyone, take advantage of LinkedIn. We have Flyer Connection that we've launched it in over a year, and we have just under 2,000 alums that are on the platform that have signed up to help you. So make sure that you get on that platform and complete your profile. Right now, we've got 41 states represented and 18 countries with alums in there. So if you are looking for ways to meet people, make sure that you do that. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you again, and go Flyers. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.